So, as many of you know, one of the reasons I set up the talent equation in the first place was because I knew that there was a lot of people out there with young people who are striving to try something out in sport. They're thinking maybe we'll give this a go. Let's see how far we can get and what have you. And I knew out there that there were a lot of people out there, coaches, parents, all that sort of stuff, trying to navigate this really super complex world and trying to help young people to develop as well as possible. And one of the people that I've come to spend quite a lot of time with and have some good conversations with, and really has a message that really resonates with the whole talent equation concept, is Richard Shorter, who also goes by the alias of Non-Perfect Dad, which resonates with me, because if you could ever find a non-perfect dad, that is definitely me. I've recently had a weekend where my wife's been away with the girls, and the evidence of non-perfectness is very, very prevalent. Anyway, so Richard and I have been talking for quite a little while, and we had the brainwave idea of putting together a course where we could take our conversations and some of the conversations that Richard has been talking about within his book, Conversations for the Journey, and bring them to life a little bit more with some actionable insights and some sharing of our thoughts and experiences to help other people out there who are trying to navigate this world to try and find their way through it a little bit easier. Richard joins me today to talk about the course. Richard, great to have you back, and just tell everybody a little bit about what they can expect from the course.
Thank you, Stuart. Well, I think, as I've had this incredible privilege in the last few years to travel around the country speaking at sports teams at all stages of that talent pathway and at schools, I regularly hear parents just talk about the discomfort of car journeys or post-match phone calls that have been really tricky. I hear coaches say that they realise that the conversations that mums and dads have with their children, often well-meaning, are a cause of challenge for coaches because they can see what it does to their athletes. And I've also had this privilege of spending quite a bit of time with the athletes, listening to them feedback about the conversations they have with parents. And again, they recognise their parents are well-meaning, but they recognise that there's a challenge in that conversation. And so you and I sat down and mapped out this course, which is in two elements. To start off with, it's a free video course. And the aim was simply to how do we upskill parents in their ability to have conversations which contribute to their children flourishing and releasing their potential. All the parents I speak to all want to see their children flourish and to be the best version of themselves they can be. And most of the parents I talk to have the humility to say, that doesn't always go to plan. And so I wanted you and I, two honest dads, to sit down, have a conversation, conversations which not only apply our non-perfect parenting, but apply our experience, our qualifications, our wisdom, because between the two of us, we've got to have at least 45 years experience in the sports world and engaging with parents. And I wanted us to harness not only our conversations as dads, but our conversations as professionals to help parents fuel that potential in their children and to avoid some of those really common pitfalls and pain points that they have in those pre-game and post-game conversations.
And brilliant. It was really enjoyable doing it, and definitely it was actually quite a useful kind of period of reflection for me in many ways, talking about it as a sports parent and also as as a parent who coaches as well, because that's also adds to the challenges and adds to the complexity. Definitely. So you've been kind enough to put together, you've got a special discount code for subscribers to the Talent Equation, people who are listeners, and also people who are subscribers as part of my, kind of on my Patreon community. So where can they go to get, kind of a privileged access?
So if you go to nonperfectdad/talent equation, you'll find a link in there to discount it by $5 because the site we're using is in dollars, $5 more than everybody else gets it at. But first of all, I'd encourage them to sign up for the free course, which can be found at conversationsforgrowth.co.uk. The 4 is the number 4, so that's conversationsforgrowth.co.uk. All share that free course in their team's WhatsApp groups, because I'm sure parents could sign up for that for free. They get a snippet of our kind of 10-minute conversations emailed to them every day for 10 days to enable them to start to reflect on these pain points. And then obviously, if they felt that was valuable, they can then go and purchase the longer course, which you and I have done. And as you say, we wanted to honour the Talent Equation community. I recognise the support the Talent Equation community has given me since our last podcast. And so if you go to nonperfectdad/Talent Equation, you will find an even bigger discount code there for your listeners.
Brilliant stuff. Thanks very much.
Welcome to the Talent Equation podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Well, this week I'm really pleased to be able to be joined by James Stafford, who is an intrepid researcher in all things ecological dynamics and coaching. So, James, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Stuart. I'm very excited to have a discussion. I'm a regular listener of the podcast, so just really excited to get going.
Good. Well, as always, I guess the starting point is to sort of introduce yourself to the audience and give us your potted history or your backstory, something along those lines.
Yes, of course. So I'm currently a PhD student at Queen's University based in Belfast. I studied my undergrad there in psychology, and then after my undergraduate, I came on board with Professor Cathy Craig in the Movement Innovation Lab that's based in Belfast, which has a very strong ecological underpinnings and it's very strong ecological basis. So from there is where I really started to get introduced to these concepts of affordances and, attunement and information. And really, although my research isn't directly involved with coaching, I've sort of fallen into coaching as a sort of key interest. I have a very keen interest in sports and how that can be applied to coaching. So that's sort of how I fell into that area.
And so, first and foremost, one of the things that really intrigued me when we were kind of conversing, I suppose, on Twitter, which is often the case, is that you're involved in something called a movement innovation lab. Mm-hmm. And in itself, that's just immediately piques the interest. So I guess tell me a bit more about what you're working on there and some of the ideas that you guys are sort of throwing around.
Yes, so the Movement Innovation Lab was started by Cathy Craig a good while ago now, and really the underpinnings of the Movement Innovation Lab was these ecological concepts of how information guides movement, and has a very strong emphasis on using virtual reality technology to achieve that. So everyone in our lab is very involved in designing virtual environments and then building certain scenarios and seeing how they behave. So we have a very strong underpinning in sport. Cathy's work has been very involved in rugby and soccer. My particular research is in aging, and what I do is I set up paradigms where you're crossing the road. It's a very nice specific example, which is very commonly used in ecological psychology because you have this dynamic, ever-changing concept of affordances, and then we see how people regulate their actions in accordance to the information that's arising from the oncoming cars in these virtual environments. But I do a lot of other stuff as well. I have an ongoing current research project using virtual reality in cricket, and we're studying the effects of pressure on the perception action systems. And I've done a slight bit of work involved in sort of other sports as well. And as I'm working with my new part-time company at the moment, Incisive, where they're currently doing free kicks in soccer. So I'm doing a bit of work in that as well.
Well, there's plenty to dig into there. So virtual reality specifically. So what is it that how do you go about kind of setting up some of these, I guess, experiments or tests using virtual reality? What's the way you're kind of working within a virtual reality space? Very much a Rob Gray thing, this feels like to me.
Yes, very much so. And Rob and Cathy would sort of be the two sort of figureheads for virtual reality, and certainly for interceptive actions, Rob would do a lot of the work in baseball, and then the Movement Innovation Lab here in Belfast would do a lot of research in cricket. So they're very complementary because the perception action system and the skills involved in that are very similar. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the beautiful thing about virtual reality, and that's why ecological dynamics is very attracted to it, is that you control the information that the brain and the movement systems are picking up. And because action unfolds the same way the information unfolds, it gives you a very nice paradigm in which you can study different movements, see how people use different information sources to achieve actions. So just really that control it gives you is what makes it so attractive.
And I suppose, I guess, because one of the challenges that people studying from an ecological perspective, when it comes to particularly dynamic and complex sports forms, is they don't lend themselves very well to lab-based studies, because immediately you begin to lose some of the representativeness of the activity. But conversely, when you're trying to conduct these kinds of experiments in the field, it's very difficult to control the various different factors and parameters that then make it quite difficult to be able to draw conclusive conclusions. And so by using virtual reality, I suppose what you're able to do is to bring some aspect of realism, certainly in terms of I'm assuming the visual array, while still making it controllable enough that you can actually begin to interpret the results effectively. Is that part of the appeal?
I totally agree, yes. And even when you start to think of it from a sort of constraints-led approach, what virtual reality allows you to do is control the hardest constraint there is to manipulate, which is the informational constraints, such as the spin applied on a ball, how you regulate yourself according to that. What we try to do in our virtual environments is, as you say, make them as representative as possible. And one of the ways we really like to do that, particularly when we're studying dynamic things like team sports, is we use a lot of motion capture. So we would motion capture people, generate an avatar which maps one-to-one with their movements, and then put them in the virtual environment. And what that allows us to do is we have an entirely representative movement that happened in the real world. We import it into a virtual reality scene, but what it allows us to do is have control over that avatar. So we can do things like generate repetitions of that movement exactly the same, which is an impossible thing to do in real life. We can mirror the movement, so you can have so let's say a rugby player approaching to tackle you on the right. We can mirror that exactly so it happens on the left. That's a very, very useful feature when you want to understand things like movement bias. So people who are stronger on the right-hand side or the left-hand side, that's a very powerful tool for understanding concepts like that. But yes, it always comes back to the idea of virtual reality allows us to control information, which then allows us to see how people behave in a representative manner according to the information that we present to them.
Now, just as a quick aside from, just as a quick sort of deviation, right at the start, you were talking about some of your research in aging, and particularly looking at how people cross the road. I mean, I know this is slightly off the track of sport, but I think it's really interesting because I guess it tells us, well, I think it's important actually from the perspective of public health in actual fact, and also how, for example, people can engage in physical activity as they get older. And I know you're obviously still going through this process in terms of your study, but I'd be interested to know any of the, kind of what's out there in the literature, and then also kind of what are the particular areas that you're looking into, and any initial findings that you're coming across.
Of course, yeah, and it's funny you say about road crossing. Although on the face value, it does look very far away from sport. But when you start to look at it from an ecological dynamics and an information perspective, the information is very transferable. So if you're worried about, say, the time to contact of a car, that's going to be very, very similar perceptual information to the time to contact of an approaching rugby player. So let's say that the information you're using to control that guidance is tau, which is the current size of a gap and its rate of closure. Then there's transferable abilities there. But yes, my research in road crossing and aging was really sort of stemmed out when you sort of look at the fatality statistics in sort of traffic environments, and you see a very clear trend in age where you would have very young kids getting hit by cars quite a lot, and then you're very, very stable in your fatality accidents statistics when you're middle-aged, and then suddenly it spikes up again when you're older. And the literature that's out there sort of tries to see this in a very, I suppose you would say, information processing perspective, in that you've got these cognitive representations which are being impacted by the aging process, and we can just interpret that as the reason why when we get older we become worse at judging the time to contact of cars. What we're trying to do is sort of frame it more from an ecological perspective, is like, what are the information sources that these elderly pedestrians are tuning into to decide whether a gap between cars affords crossing or not. And what we seem to be finding is that young kids and older adults are less sensitive to perceptual invariance, or information which reliably specifies that a gap affords crossing or that gap doesn't. And it's funny, I do see a lot of interesting parallels that could be used here for sport. One of the most interesting ones is for young kids, they don't really perceptually mature in terms of time to contact until they're about 13. So what happens is when kids see approaching cars that are traveling at a very high speed, they will misjudge the time to arrival of the car. And the reason why is because they're less sensitive to what we call looming, or that idea of the rate of change of the car's image size on your eye, which tells you how fast it's approaching. And sometimes I hear the argument in cricket is that, oh, we should expose our kids to very, very fast deliveries, because then what you're doing is you're sort of priming them for when they get older. Oh, this kid has been facing 90-mile-per-hour deliveries since they were 12. But the problem with that is that you're not mature enough yet in terms of your perceptual systems to deal with objects coming at you at that speed. So there are a lot of interesting parallels between these paradigms. What I like to think of it as, the research isn't paradigm driven, but rather idea driven. So the findings should transfer across several domains if they're done right.
I mean, that makes total sense to me, but it's also now made me pause for a second, because I've sort of been operating under I've been operating under an idea that one of the things we ought to do with young people is to give them the opportunity to, for example, play games, or to play designed games, or designer games, if you like, or constrained games, as a means by which to enable them to become more attuned to potential perceptual information sources that enable them to solve the problems that game presents. So they become kind of more, I describe it as being, they become technicians as opposed to technicians, because most sporting paradigms are based on the idea, or traditionally, I suppose, traditional approaches are, learn movement patterns in the form of techniques, apply them into the game context. Obviously, ecological approach looking at the other way around and almost saying, right, design a game context, and then what movement patterns are going to be most appropriate to solve the problems that the game presents. But in order to be able to start to devise some of those movement patterns, a young person or athlete would need to be able to sort of, I guess, perceptually understand, or I guess not necessarily explicitly perceptually understand, what the what the information that's coming at them is, and then act accordingly. But at least implicitly respond to those those game-like stimulus, and then move in certain ways. Now, if you're saying to me that the organism, i.e., the child, isn't yet ready to be able to perceptually attune to that, then, or at least you're finding in the literature that they're not able to perceptually attune to, say, gaps, then that suggests to me that coaches looking to develop in young people, children before the age of approximately 13, the ability to perceive a gap and therefore play these kinds of clever passing through balls. That might not be the right time to be doing that. They probably want young people to perceptually attune to different things. Is that a fair summary, or have I gone a little bit too far?
No, I would definitely say do design the scenario to attune to gaps, because it's particularly if you're from sort of this sort of David Lee perspective of the environment is entirely made up of closing gaps, and then it's entirely down to you being able to attune to them. I definitely think that's the way to go. The only problem with the closure of gaps is that at a certain threshold, the gaps become too difficult for young kids to pick up. So this really only applies to very high speeds. So we're talking probably over 35 miles per hour.
Okay.
So for small-sided games, there really is no issue, and that's what we're finding, particularly with the road crossing stuff, is that under certain constraints, they're fine. There's no issue. They can pick up the invariance, no issue at all. It's only when you sort of get to these upper extremes, and this is where these etiological concepts of action boundaries come in, is that there's a region of information which the children can operate, and they're happy and they're comfortable operating in that sphere, and then there are certain informational constraints which are just pushing them too far out of their boundaries, and then it's just catastrophe, really. They can't cope with it. So for small-sided games, I really see no issue. The only scenario I can think of in sport where that is a problem is if you're really hurling high-speed objects at a child, which would be the case in cricket or baseball or these very particular scenarios.
And I suppose the converse of that then, that's useful, because I was slightly concerned that we've been doing the wrong thing.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
And I guess it makes some sense, actually, because what you're studying, I suppose, is closure at speed, aren't you? And that's one of the things that the perceptual attunement isn't there. So what was interesting for me, though, just talking about that, is and forgive me for always kind of bringing things into kind of the real world, I suppose, because as I try and grapple with some of these concepts and make sense of them. So the idea of operational boundaries is quite an interesting one, because I think one of the ways that manifests itself, for example, in a dynamic sport, say like football, is you always get coaches go, oh God, how do we get these kids to space out? How do we get them to use space effectively? And a part of me is always saying to them, they're really young children, right? And that's not actually what we want them necessarily right now to do, because the major attractor to them is the ball. That's what they want to get,
Absolutely.
And so it's entirely natural for them to get as close to it as possible. And they're not yet able to appreciate that the game is actually asking them to utilize space more effectively. And so I see loads and loads of coaches, and I was one of them for a long time, just stop it, spread out, come on, use space. But actually, by the clever design of learning environments that actually challenge the children to the way they can win the game, for example, or the way they can be successful in the game, is not only by getting the ball, but by getting the ball in certain places, then begins to develop that kind of, firstly, awareness of where do I need to be in order to be able to help my team win the game, and secondly, and therefore the search and the scanning that they require to do that. And then the other bit is the collaborative approach that they need to have with each other to be able to communicate as to where one might need to be in order to be successful in performing these actions. And so going down that road, that's a really good example, I think, of an operational boundary, isn't it? Is initially the game actually drives children, because of the nature of it, towards playing in very small areas. And actually, by changing the dynamics of the game, you can then get them or encourage them to become more exploratory in the space they have available.
Yep, absolutely. And the literature always comes out with these, what we call them optimal regions. And what that means is actions emerge and then in a certain sort of information space, and what they are is they're most efficient in that area. So like if they always use the example of climbing stairs, there's a certain stair rise or height relative to your leg length that is the most comfortable for you to be climbing on. And it's how you design that game that will drive what kids perceive to be an optimal region to behave in, So and we come back to this idea of joint affordances, working together to tune into the information which will benefit the two of them together as one sort of organism.
Yeah.
So I absolutely agree with that. But the beautiful thing about the ecological approach to this problem is that eventually they will attune to these information sources, and then they will self-organize themselves, and it'll be much more fluid and dynamic instead of simply, as you say, saying, no, kids, you need to be more spaced apart. And then what will happen is in an in-game context, what will happen is they'll just start floating back towards the ball again. They'll fall back into their initial region which they operated in.
Yeah. And I think the other thing, I suppose, is that the point about those optimal regions, and that's a really important point, because in relative terms, to these young, we're talking about kids like 6 and 7 or 8 years old, and there is partly an argument that whether they should be doing formal sport at that age anyway, but that's a different discussion. But there's that dimension of in terms of their kind of operational boundaries, the level of proximity that we see as adults seems like it's ridiculously dense, and it is, because they're all in a very, very small area. But to them, it probably feels quite naturally spaced. Maybe not quite, but certainly, I mean, firstly, they're smaller, and secondly, they are orientating themselves in the space based on their proximity to the ball.
Yep.
And so, of course, to them, that feels, I've definitely seen young children who stand further away from the ball than others, and I think they genuinely think they're in loads of space. Yep. Now, the fact that the pitch itself is enormous and they could be in far, far more space, in their mind, that makes absolutely no sense, because the chances of the ball arriving at them is slim, because the other people around them aren't really able to propel the ball that far anyway. And so it doesn't make any sense to be that far away, so they can be away, but not as far away as we would think. And so I suppose it's all about the lens that the child is looking at the game through.
I agree. I think coaches sometimes sort of we try to impose an adult way of thinking on the kids instead of letting them behave like kids. Yeah. And the thing is, with certain kids as well, they're still figuring out what affordances are for them. They're still understanding what their action capabilities are. So for some kids, and you're talking about that different distances of the ball, maybe a young defender thinks, if a attacking player gets that ball, I have enough time to get to them and closure that gap. Whereas another child on the same team may think, actually, no, for my action capabilities, I need to be closer. But action capabilities are constantly being redefined, especially when we're young. They're constantly changing. We experience a huge period of growth when we're around 6 and 8, which is what you're saying, the kids should be around playing at that age anyway. So they're still figuring all that out. And by imposing these sort of set distances on them, it's not really helping them, because you're just going by what the coach says, and you're not allowing for those exploratory movements the kids need to figure out their action boundaries, their action capabilities, and all the other sort of ecological dynamics features that we think are important.
And I suppose so what is just flipping right back to what you were talking about around closure distances, is that seen as being one of the main reasons for pedestrian fatalities in road accidents like that?
Yeah, certainly from a perceptual perspective, they're not picking up the information that specifies the rate of closure so that we like to think of road crossing as a closure of two gaps. You've got the gap between the pedestrian and the two curbs, and then you've got the gap between the pedestrian and the car. And what happens is, when we're quite young and when we're quite old is that we can't quite sense the relative closure of those two gaps. So what happens is you think, oh yeah, my current closure rate between these two curves is fine. I've got enough time. I'm going to make it across, no problem. And then what happens is the car sneaks up on you and will sort of collide with you essentially. So it's that information which they're not quite attuning to, and that's what's resulting in the collisions. Right. And it'll be the same in soccer. It'll be the same in rugby. If you do not perceive the relative closure of those gaps, what's going to happen is you're going to get taken out. You see, this is a really big problem with concussion and return to play. Yeah. Is that concussion disturbs the visual array. Yeah. So the doctors will clear the players because they passed all these cognitive tests, such as, what's the score, what's the time on the clock. The players will fluke through that system. And then what happens is, because their perception action systems are still disturbed and they haven't recalibrated to that change in their visual input, they're misperceiving these closure of gaps, which is why they're getting these sort of really bad head-on collisions. And what happens then is they get 2 concussions in a short period of time, which can lead to very substantial brain damage.
That's how well known is that?
It's becoming clearer now. There's some very good research coming out by a researcher called Eagles, and he is starting to explore this idea of how concussion impacts the perception-action link coupling. And it's something we're actually exploring now with Incisive. Is we want to start introducing better tests that explore how the injured player is regulating this perception-action coupling. Because if that's wrong, what will happen is you will get cleaned out because you misperceive the affordance. It's a very, very serious problem.
And I assume so. That second concussion comes along very rapidly because the individual isn't able to make these judgments, and that second concussion is far worse because they haven't even had opportunities to kind of like brace for impact, I suppose, or at the very least, kind of minimize the impact of a fall, of the way they're falling or whatever, depending on how the concussion comes back. Because, like you say, they haven't perceived the threat. They're not ready.
Exactly. Yep. They completely misperceive the closure of the gap, and as a result, there's several ways you can deal with that problem. You can either perceive that you do not have enough time relative to the approaching player, so you pass off the ball, therefore you're sort of taking the heat off you. Yeah. Or as you say, you can brace for impact. But these are all affordance problems. Is my current closure rate of the gap enough for me to get through this gap and go on and try and score a try? Is my current movement speed not sufficient enough? So the affordance is to offload the ball, all these problems. But this is where we see injury, especially unintended injury, arising from, is this misperception of what the environment affords you. And concussion is a serious problem because it disturbs that ability to pick up that information for those affordances.
And because one of the problems with a game like rugby, for collision sports, for example, is if you want to try and identify somebody's readiness to play, then you need something that can be done more or less pitch side. So what kind of pitch side test could a practitioner do to be able to determine somebody's for example, whether their visual array has been disturbed in that way?
Yep. So this is where we see the power of virtual reality. So the Oculus and HTC Vive are currently working on headsets which require no sort of plugins to a computer. So it's ready and to go wherever you need it to be. And then it comes back to our discussion earlier on. As soon as you have a virtual reality headset, you can control the information the player is tuning to. And then what you can see is how well they're regulating their actions according to information which is reliably telling you this gap affords passing, this is a gap which is going to afford you getting taken out essentially, and you need to know the difference. And if you don't know the difference, you're going to seriously risk that second concussion and end up maybe not even returning to play ever. So virtual reality is really the way to assess that properly.
And in many ways, that's kind of an interesting thing because that could be done on the side of the pitch. But equally, if somebody is on a is on on the kind of return to play protocol and out of the game, they could essentially do their readiness to play assessment at home using the VR.
Yep. So this is where we see it going. Is you would have your players, you would establish their baseline. So you would give them an array of affordance tests. You would say, this is your affordance function, we like to call it. So the range between what you think is safe and not safe or whatever else. And then it's monitoring that return to baseline. So you've suffered a serious concussion. Instead of just giving you a standard 6-day to return protocol, we're going to say, until you reach your baseline, we do not think you're fit to return to play. And it's a way of quantifying something which has been very much up until this point a way of just feel and whether the doctors think you're right or whether you pass these very sort of simple cognitive tests.
Yeah. Which and at the moment, then the cognitive test that they're using. I mean, I assume you have some disquiet about their use and their effectiveness.
Well, there is a place for them, but we don't. The way we think about it is we're trying to augment the concussion so it's as streamlined as possible. So the concussion cognitive tests have their place, but what we really need to tap into is also how the concussion affects how you regulate yourself with the visual information. The way to very easily identify that is through movement signal. So how noisy is your gait, say, how variable is it, all these things which will give you a very clear identification. And the key thing about movement is you can't fake it. You can fake cognitive tests, you can pass them through fluking it, but you cannot fake a movement signal.
Or you can't fake how you respond to a movement signal.
Well, that's it, how the information regulates the action.
Interesting, fascinating, which essentially is the nature. Now, this is an interesting thing, though, isn't it? Because that's the nature of sport, is, kind of movement being regulated by the information that's present. But so few people understand the sporting landscape in that way. So I guess, is there a challenge here for those developing this technology to help, I guess, policymakers to understand some fundamental basic ecological principles in order to get them to understand and utilize the technology?
Yes, well, I mean, it's funny enough, we've with Incisive, we've started to scope this out with some doctors. And as soon as you explain what we're trying to do with the concussion, they just get it. And I think there's a real frustration from the doctor's perspective is that the sort of tests they have around, say, balance is very rudimentary, and it's not really getting you through the true skill aspect of coordinated movement. So we've actually seen a very positive response. So there probably will be some element of education to that, but from our perspective, when we explain the whole concept and what it's doing, particularly how it can augment what's already there, they're just like, yeah, I get it.
Wow. That's that's obviously refreshing and great to hear, because I do think my son's involved with rugby, and I do feel that something needs to be done to I guess allow people to be able to more comprehensively and coherently determine when a return to play is safe. My son recently said, he came off the training pitch and sort of complaining of, he described, he said, I was a bit dizzy and, this, that, and the other. And I'm like, well, you can't play now. And then my wife saying after about a week, oh, maybe he can go back. He seems okay now. I'm like, it doesn't work like that.
No,
but there's nothing to actually determine whether he's ready or not.
Absolutely. As soon as you start going off these ideas of, I think he's okay, it's not objective, it's entirely subjective in its way. And I think that's where the doctor's frustration comes into. And being able to look at concussion from a more of an affordance perspective, suddenly you have a quantifiable measure that the doctors can go, yes, you've hit your baseline, happy for you to return. So we really think that's where the value comes in, is instead of just this idea of feel and sort of know-how, we're giving you sort of objective, clear ways of understanding, yes, you're fine, you can go back.
Right. Now, it would not be a Talent Equation podcast if I didn't get an opportunity to wang on about cricket. And you mentioned at the start that you obviously are doing quite a bit of research in interceptive sports, baseball, cricket, etc., etc. You're focused more on cricket because obviously you're this side of the pond. Now, you wrote a brilliant thread on Twitter.
Oh, thank you very much.
All about, and it was very pertinent, obviously, because the Ashes was on and nobody could get Steve Smith out. And your interpretation of the way he plays and there's a really interesting ecological explanation around the way he plays, and you then go into what tactics might be beneficial for England to adopt in order to try and get him out. They clearly didn't read your thread because they couldn't get him out. But I recommend anybody chase that down. But can you give the sort of broad summary of what your thesis was in that thread?
Yeah, no problem. So I'm a big fan of cricket, which is quite unusual being from Ireland, where there's very few of us. But the thing that fascinated me about Steve Smith is he's incredibly almost ecological in the way he goes about things and the way he describes how he plays.
Yep.
And what's particularly interesting about Steve Smith is he has this very unique action. And what you see with some cricketers is with a batsman is they like to stay very still. And they'll just wait for the ball, and then they'll do like a slight shuffle of their feet and hit the ball. But the thing about Steve Smith is, as the bowler's approaching, is he takes this very substantial back and across movement. And the thing that really startled me about Steve Smith is when you start to think of how Steve Smith and batting in general works as an affordance task, the way he goes about it makes perfect sense, because suddenly he knows exactly what balls to leave, exactly what balls to hit. And when I was watching him, I was just like, yes, that's affordances. That's what he's attuned to, whatever information is required to specify that ball's hitting stumps, that one's missing. And the great thing about Steve Smith as well is he has this very exaggerated leave, which is really fun if you haven't watched him do it, is he would leave the ball and do this big exaggerated swing, which I'm sure frustrates the bowlers to no end. But really what I was looking at was you can explain what Steve Smith is doing as soon as you start to see his batting technique from an ecological perspective. You can sort of see how he's self-organizing. You can see what he's doing in relation to the information he's being presented with. So I wrote a thread about it, just explaining my thoughts on that. And it picked up a bit of traction. So yeah, it was pretty cool.
I mean, for me, I think you're absolutely right. I think if you're somebody who looks at sport from the perspective of orthodoxy, which is very, very dominant in cricket, in all the cricket punditry and commentary, and also very prevalent in the coaching landscape still, around the idea of that there are kind of orthodox technical movements in the action of batting. And so you learn shots, so you're taught shots. This is this shot that you play to this ball bouncing there. This is this shot that you play to. It's kind of different to sort of baseball in that sense, which is about a reaction to the ball in midair. Whereas depending on where the ball bounces, you move in a certain way and you play a certain shot. And shot selection, all the assumption is it's about shot selection, and Steve Smith turns that on its head in many ways. He actually almost plays the game the wrong way round, or in reverse of the way it kind of in an orthodox way should be played. So you can hear how I'm struggling to articulate this from the perspective of so if you're somebody who looks at the game in an orthodox way and says this is how you play the game, these are kind of the techniques and the rules, if you like, or the methods that are deemed to be most efficacious or effective, he splits that round, and he does what appears to be something that should be fraught with risk.
Yes.
For example, the vast majority of players sort of stand slightly to the side of the stumps and use a combination of leg and bat as a means by which to try and protect those stumps. He puts his legs right in front of the stumps. Yep. And what he's doing is he's bringing about the risk of the ball hitting his leg in front of the stumps, and he's in LBW. And so you think to yourself, well, that's just crazy. Why would you do that? And he does it kind of almost every time.
Mm-hmm.
But every time the bowler bowls quite straight towards the stumps, it disappears to the boundary for 4.
Yep.
Because essentially what they've done is they've delivered the ball to an area of strength for him, which is hitting. So what he's basically doing, he's taking what would be traditionally be a good ball that you'd have to defend and turning it into an attacking opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
So you can almost, when you see it in that respect, you're saying, well, actually what he does is by making this movement across, he now knows that any delivery bowled anywhere near, kind of his, in his sort of hitting arc, isn't going to hit.
Yep.
So it can be left.
Yep.
And every time the bowler bowls straighter than that, he hits them for 4.
Mm-hmm.
So that you can almost imagine bowlers just literally do not know how to bowl to that individual.
Yep. Yeah, and when you think of that from an affordance perspective, it makes so much sense. I mean, he is lining himself up with the stumps. So, and he says this about how he bats. He says that if the ball is outside of his eye line, he just leaves it because he knows that's not going to go and hit the stumps.
Yeah.
That's an affordance that whether that delivery is in his eye line or not affords collision with the pads.
Yeah.
So. And it's very, very interesting the way he approaches it and how he speaks about it. But what this really comes down to, and I mentioned this in the thread, is he's forcing the bowlers to bowl in his optimal region, which is what we were talking about earlier. He knows what part of his game is comfortable. He knows his action capabilities really well. So he's forcing the bowler to bowl where he wants him to bowl because he's presenting to the bowler the affordance of, here's my pads, hit them. Yeah. And he knows himself he has the coordinated action to be able to, as you say, hit it down. So he's never going to get hit LBW. He's so well coordinated in that area where he plays. So it's very, very fascinating how he's sort of self-organized himself in a way that he's removed the chances of getting LBW because he knows he's strong and that's his optimal region. And he also knows that if the inverse of that is true and the bowler is bowling really wide, he's like, well, that's not going to afford collision to me because I know it's outside my eye line. It's this idea that we bang on about in ecological dynamics of prospective control, being able to coordinate your actions based on the current future. And he knows if that ball is outside his eye line, the current future for that ball is missing. So it's really no problem to him at all. And that's why I was really drawn to this, to Steve Smith in particular, is that from an ecological perspective, I can explain that. But if you look at that from an information processing perspective, you would have no idea what he's doing. It would be like, okay, so what are his mental representations for this action? And then how is he organizing his actions and his motor programs in relation to that? So that's why I was really gravitating towards Smith in particular, is the way he speaks and the way he behaves. It's like it's there for you to see and how he organizes himself. And that's how I sort of began to conceptualize a way of getting him out, is you can see how he defines his affordances. So then we need to figure out a way to get him to misperceive the affordance.
Yeah.
So that's what I sort of went on to explain later on, is how you would actually go about doing that.
And so I can't leave that hanging. So how this is for anybody listening who's from the England cricket team or any other cricket team around the world, by the way, this is it now. And in actual fact, there's a part of me thinks you shouldn't give this away because, this could be worth a fortune. But you might want to just give them enough of a tidbit because they're probably not going to be able to appreciate the complexities. But broadly speaking, your thesis on getting Steve Smith out is?
It all boils down to action boundaries. Right. So the action boundary is the transition from one style of action to another and the point that becomes necessary. So I'll give you an example. So you've got, say, a tennis ball in front of you. That tennis ball's current properties means that your action boundary can mean you can grasp it with one hand. If you double the size of that tennis ball, the action boundary shifts and you have to grab it with two hands. It's the same for Smith when he's batting. When the ball is going is very far inside his eye line, he can see the affordance of hit every time. When the ball is really far outside his eye line, he sees a very obvious leave. So the trick would be the same with the tennis ball, is that if you got that tennis ball to the size where it might afford grasping with one hand, or maybe I have to do both, it's that region in which the affordance is uncertain is the point in where the action's really impacted. So the way I've formulated my hypothesis for Smith is that you need to bowl near to his eye line, because that is what he is using from an informational perspective to switch between hit and leave. So you need to bowl a line that's as close to Smith's eye line as possible, because that's what he's using to define the affordance of leave or hit. The research is quite good on this, and research by Joe Smith and Hert Jan and his Pepping. And they say when you operate close to this area where you switch from play to leave, or grasp with one hand or grasp with two hands, the affordance is harder to perceive, and it manifests itself in the action as well. You have more variable movement, and your timing is impacted in terms of speed and consistency. So if you bowl close to Smith's eye line, what you're doing is you're getting him at a point where he's like, is it leave? Is it play? I'm not sure what the affordance is. Then he'll get caught in two minds, and what will happen is either the ball will go on to hit the off stump, or he'll nick it and it'll go to first or second slip.
Now, I thought that I saw your conclusion, and that, but that I was also left with an idea about that, around the idea of, but that's how you bowl to every batsman.
Generally, yeah.
And I suppose the thing with him is, I think what he's done is slightly different, and so I guess I see his approach through the lens of kind of affordances as well, but in a slightly perhaps different way. And I've got a slightly different theory, and we'll have to test them. But I think he has learned, and again, he is another one of these kind of backyard type players. But I think he learned that he was very strong, or one of his major strengths was hitting the ball from his legs, hitting the ball in front of his legs.
Mm-hmm.
So you rarely see the ball hit his pads.
Yep.
Very rarely. And I think what he realised was what are the risk factors for him. And I did a bit of a study off the back of your thread, because it kind of got me a bit interested. So I started to look at how does he get out.
Yep.
And how does he get out, and who does he get out to? And there are some very clear. It's quite clear who gets him out and how they get him out. Anyway, but he's particularly susceptible to left arm bowlers coming over the wicket.
Mm-hmm.
He's particularly susceptible to left arm spinners as well. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether they come over around the wicket. And he's particularly susceptible to the bouncing ball, which I think one of the reasons I think Jofra Archer was so instrumental. He was the only person who caused him a degree of difficulty. Mm-hmm. But I think what he's worked out is, like, where's the risk? Well, the risk is for him is like being caught behind, like most batters. And so if he takes the kind of outside the off stump delivery out of the equation by just leaving it, then he takes away the risk. And he knows there is very little risk of him getting out LBW, because he doesn't miss the ball in front of his pads, or very rarely does. And so what he's doing is two things, really. He's minimizing risk and optimizing his strengths, which makes total sense. Now, my mind was like, well, yeah, so I get that. So then the problem you've got then is, right, okay, well, we've got a bowl in the area where, what they call the corridor of uncertainty, isn't it? Do I play? Yes. Do I leave?
Yeah.
But the problem is his corridor of uncertainty is massive, because he's taken this step across. And so it's actually not that uncertain for him, because anything outside, or even almost under his eye line, is going to miss, unless it moves appreciably off the seam. But it just doesn't happen that often. He'd be very, very susceptible, I think, to a swing bowler, somebody like Jimmy Anderson. It's a shame we didn't have him, who could make the ball move both ways. I think he'd be susceptible to that at pace, particularly if he can get the ball to swing late. But we didn't have one of those. So you're left with seam, and you don't get that level of seam movement. So my theory was that we could get him to be where his area of leave or hit would be on the opposite side of the stumps, towards the leg side. Now, traditionally, that's seen as his strength. Don't bowl there, he hits you for 4. But he plays the ball there. He has to play the ball there, or he's out.
Mm-hmm.
So I would be inclined to, and they got him right at the end, leg slip.
Mm-hmm.
So my view would be to have the leg side where the fielders would be. You're a bit limited by the rules, but that's where I would have my fielders, and I would encourage him to play. That's where I would want him to get that kind of action boundary area. Do I play or do I leave in this area? Well, I have to play. Oh, how well, and so he might get himself out hitting in the air, and I'd have all my fielders on that side. So I would reverse the field, almost have three on the offside, crack on, 7 on the leg side, and say, come on, hit the ball through there, and we'll just see what we can do. At the very least, we dry the runs up, and if you get it wrong, we'll get you out. And I'd bowl at his legs.
Yep. I mean, the benefit of that is that because, as you say, Smith has such a clear perception action strategy in what he's doing. What, from a bowler's perspective, is if we can't get him out, at least force him to change his strategy.
Yes.
So if you're peppering him so he has to hit the ball every time, or you're drying up the runs, you're then eventually going to come to a point where Smith's like, I'm going to have to do something different here if I want the game to change, or the bowlers are getting on top of me. So that's a very, very valid strategy. The other thing with the left arm bowlers is, and I think the beautiful thing about the left arm spin is that it comes back to this eye-line thing and this affordance concept, because if you get the ball to spin away from Smith, what you're getting to do is that ball is originally in his eye-line, so Smith picks up the affordance of hit.
Yeah. But
because the ball's moving, it then, if you read it correctly, he should be leaving that ball, but he's not, because he's basing it on his eye-line. And this is a really important concept, is that if we look at it from an affordance perspective, we don't really understand, how do we move forward from here? But if you start to understand what the information is he's using to define the affordance, suddenly you realize, okay, this is what we're going to do to get him out. And it's exactly the exact same when you're saying there about Jimmy Anderson's swing. The ball starts outside his eye line and it comes back in. So when he sees the ball originally, he's going, okay, outside my eye line, that's no problem. But the fact that it swings back in bypasses Smith's perceptual strategy. Yeah. So sometimes we get carried away and we say, Smith is the impossible batsman to get out. But actually, when you look at it from that perspective, Smith's strategy is non-specifying. It's not a 100% of the time this strategy is going to work. But it's like you said earlier, the benefit of Smith's strategy is you need a moving ball, or you need the pitch to be giving you something for those strategies to work. If the pitch is dead, or you don't have a bowler who can manipulate the ball in that way, you really are limited in what you can do. And I think that's the point you were saying, that you then switched almost to the leg side, and then you're forcing Smith to do something a bit different.
Yeah, I mean, it's an unorthodox way of approaching bowling at a player. Yeah. But what made me think about it particularly was I see him, or the way I perceive his action is, he almost plays like a right-handed left-hander.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And so you'd set almost like a left-handed field. Yeah. And I was looking at the way, so for example, Stuart Broad, another one of the kind of major bowlers for England, he was really effective against Australia's left-handers, particularly David Warner, who's traditionally one of the better players in the world, by coming around the wicket and bowling a ball that kind of starts on the stumps and leaves that player. So every time he plays at that shot, the amount of times he got caught behind in that area, because again, that's a ball that's coming at him, leaving him. He got to play at it because, that's going to hit my stumps, I must play. And obviously it's the deviation that, because it's the batsman's inability to be able to perceive the deviation.
Yes.
Partly to do with the proximity of the ball, how close the ball lands to the batsman. They don't have enough time to be able to make an adjustment. So in my mind, I was thinking that you could potentially bowl at Smith like that, where you could bowl down a leg stump corridor. Now, if he moves across from there, he exposes his stump, so he has to stay put. So he has to change. He can't do that movement anymore.
Exactly.
Plus, he hasn't got the luxury of being able to leave every single ball, because there's a possibility that the ball might hit his stumps. So he has to play. He has to play, but then you need catchers in behind. Now, the rules of cricket are such that you can only have 2 catchers behind on the leg side. that's a challenge. Then you've got enough people to actually affect the strategy that you're looking for. But I would say that's worth it, because the other option wasn't working, so it would have been worth a go, wouldn't it?
Yes, and as well, we talk about action boundaries, and when I've been talking about action boundaries, they're very specific to circumstances. So when we were talking about action boundaries, I'm talking specifically about Steve Smith's off stump.
Yes.
So we're not quite sure what his action boundaries are around the leg stump, because we haven't bolted him enough in that area. So at the very least, what you're doing is you're starting to figure Steve Smith out from that area. It's like, okay, we know his affordance function for this. We know his corridor of uncertainty is this. What's his corridor of uncertainty on the leg side? And if it's bigger, then brilliant. That's our new strategy. So, you're basing your strategy, and I think performance analysts would be very much benefited when they start to look at this from an affordance and information perspective, is that you can manipulate your field, you can manipulate the bowlers in such a way that you're trying to put that batsman in that area of uncertainty. And the only way to figure that out is to try different things.
I mean, interestingly, you mentioned performance analysts. It's interesting how quite a lot of the analytics community are really quite either interested or very influenced by perception action and kind of ecological principles. I've certainly come across several who are interpreting kind of like sports analytics from an ecological perspective in order to provide coaches with kind of and actually help them with practice design to support their development.
Yep, and that makes total sense, because when you start to look at an environment instead of entirely being reconstructed in the head by cognitive inferences, and then you start to look at the environment as this sort of landscape of affordances, suddenly you can start to pick out opportunities that players are missing. You can start to figure out opposition players, okay, they're not quite attuned to this type of information, so that's why we should really target this. A nice example I came across on Twitter was it was the World Cup, I think it was 8 years ago in rugby, and it was Tommy Smith and James O'Connor. And James O'Connor did a really, really nice constant bearing angle strategy, which is they kept the bearing angle between him and Tommy Bowe constant, so he was managed to intercept the player. So Tommy took an interception and he broke out, and James O'Connor made this massive constant bearing angle and managed to intercept him. And the question I asked myself when I watched that is, well, what could Tommy Bowe have done differently? What could he have done to break away there and get away from James O'Connor? Because it's not the case where as soon as James O'Connor gets that constant bearing angle, well, then is Tommy Bowe just doomed to get tackled? The way around that is, Bill Warren has done some really interesting research in this, is that what you should do is zigzag, because the moment you start to zigzag is you're breaking out that constant bearing angle. So if Tommy Bowe began to zigzag, James O'Connor constantly has to re-establish that constant bearing angle, and that requires latency because that takes time to re-establish that strategy. So there's a good example there of, from just watching a video and seeing what the players did in terms of information and affordances, I was able to figure out, okay, there's something Tommy Bowe could have done differently without even have to consult the players about it.
That's interesting, isn't it? But you see, again, that's not something that traditionally. So in his mindset, I suppose, he thinks there's me, there's a line. If I go as fast as I can in a straight line, I'll get there before that individual. Do you think it also might have been a gap, the perception of the gap closing rate error?
Yes, so for that, that's from Bowe's end, that's what's happening, is he's misperceiving that time to contact of James O'Connor. So that's something for the performance analyst to take the coach and say, when Tommy's making this break, he really needs to be turning his head, exploring what the environment is around him, because unless he looks at the player, he won't see the affordance.
Right. And I suppose, like you say, in fact, who did I talk to? I talked to somebody a few episodes back about this. The zigzag idea is, I've explored this idea as well, which is a concept called pinning. Mm-hmm. And what that is a deceptive movement that essentially appears, well, in fact, it is. I mean, so for example, you've got, so if I remember actually this, I remember the video right. So you've got Tommy Bowe, and he's basically running down the right wing. He's in the clear, and he's running to the line. Is that right?
Yep.
And you've got James O'Connor coming on an angle from around about the 22 almost, isn't he? But he's on a direct diagonal angle, isn't he?
Yes, they hold almost the length of the pitch.
That's right. Yeah, it was a long way. So they go in like that, and basically, I think Tommy Bowe clearly thinks he's got the speed to be able to get there, and James O'Connor is obviously closing him down. So what they're saying, the concept of pinning would be that Tommy Bowe would make a short-ish movement towards the angle that James O'Connor's coming on.
Yeah.
Which would cause James O'Connor to pause for a fraction of a second as he recalibrates and readjusts.
Yeah, exactly.
And then he would then go back on his original line, and James O'Connor would not be able to recapture him. It's the idea of it's a movement towards the defending player, closing the space, which they then think, oh, I need to, and then you go away again, and it's too late. You're gone.
Exactly. And the only way to understand that is to understand the information they're using. Because if you didn't understand that he's maintaining a constant bearing angle, you would never be able to figure out, okay, well, what's the way to manipulate that information to make it difficult for the player? It's similar to time to contact, and why we struggle so much to intercept curved free kicks is because we have limitations in our visual system to pick up spin. So that's why the curved free kicks are so difficult for the goalkeepers. But it's exactly that. You're breaking out of that constant bearing angle, forcing the attacking or the defending player to try and reform that in enough time that he can still close down the player in enough time.
But just talking about that, that's interesting. So curved free kicks, but the curvature is constant, is it not? So surely Andrew Wilson's research is a lot on this, isn't it? About essentially ball flight and constant curvature, and therefore you're making constant perceptual adjustments. I assume where goalkeepers go wrong is that in the environment in which they're learning to make these kinds of adjustments and judgments, the problem is that they're basing it on it's essentially a prediction error, because they go, ball's leaving, it's going to arrive there, and they get it wrong, as opposed to utilizing their perception action capability to be making micro adjustments or right up to the last second. Is that right?
Yeah. So this is a very common problem, and I remember you talking to Ben Franks about this. Is that goalkeepers will, and it actually is a lot of it's a reflection of how we train goalkeepers. Is we make them these stimulus response creatures, where as soon as something happens, they respond. And I would see a lot of training videos of goalkeepers where they use point light displays, where when the light turns green, you have to hit it as fast as you can. Yeah. Those are good for sort of point blank reactive saves, but they don't teach you anything about regulating actions according to information. So this is something where we've built an Incisive. We've built a goalkeeping simulator, which we're currently trying to get on board with some academy teams. We're trying to train goalkeepers. You can afford to wait a bit longer so your visual system can pick up the unfolding dynamics of the ball. Otherwise, you will, as you say, fall into this trap of, as soon as anything happens with the ball, you make this prediction problem of you move the wrong way, and then you're forced to cover almost twice the distance because you've had this initial erroneous movement.
And that's why often you see, don't you, what look like relatively innocuous shots going in, often because, and they talk about it all the time, the pundits talk about it all the time, the goalkeeper makes this half step in the wrong direction, and then the ball goes in the opposite area, and then they're left, and they're not able to recover the ground quickly enough. So the point you would make is, and this is partly because they don't get enough, in my view, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but in my view, they don't get enough opportunities to become attuned to the perceptual information when a free kick is struck with a whole array of bodies creating a lot of visual chaos in front of them. You can imagine that you don't get enough time to attune to that, and they're pretty critical moments. So if it was me, I'd give them plenty of time to attune to it. And then what they're then doing is they take this step based on their prediction, and then when that prediction turns out to be false, they're not able to recover quickly enough to be able to make the save, and it looks like a pretty soft goal. But in reality, what they should be doing is staying far more neutral in their movement till far later. They've actually got more time than they think.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a concept we talk a lot about ecological dynamics, is affordance-based control. So you can afford to wait a bit longer because, especially for expert goalkeepers, they have the action capabilities to still cover that ground.
Yeah.
Whereas when you make the erroneous movement, you've got factors like inertia, and then trying to force your movement back in the opposite direction becomes a lot more difficult. And the point you raise about they don't have time to attune to the information, it's because it's really hard to get practice in that area. It's really hard for players to consistently generate curve free kicks which are on target. So it's being able to reliably manipulate the constraints is really difficult, and that's why Incisive is very, very excited about their new product, which is Clean Sheet. So what we've done is we've used all our research in virtual reality technology to build a goalkeeping simulator where the coaches have entirely control over the spatial constraints, so where you place the ball, the temporal constraints, how fast the balls move, the informational constraints, how much spin is generated on that ball. And suddenly you can rep out 100 free kicks in 20 minutes, all with different curves, speeds, distances, where you're giving your keepers that chance to really attune to that information. And then what we do is we track all that performance and we put it on a dashboard online so the coaches can log in and see, okay, here are the key factors for our keepers when they're facing these type of free kicks. They're not moving fast enough. Maybe it is, as you say, they're making an erroneous movement. Maybe their movement efficiency isn't enough, too much hesitation. All these factors play a part, and it's being able to reliably access that information for the keepers or the coaches to make an informed decision. So that's why we're very excited about that product, is you're giving your keepers a chance to practice well, and then you're also not forcing your outfield players to waste time in training, constantly taking free kicks, hoping that they're on target.
So that's that's almost like the equivalent of, and you see it happening all the time, there's a couple of things there, but it's a little bit like F1, Formula One drivers driving the tracks on a PlayStation a little bit. It's not obviously as good, but that's what they're doing really. They're trying to get a bit of a sense of how does this track move, where am I, how do I move around like that, ahead of then actually driving the track. It's almost an equivalent version of that.
Yep, absolutely. And it's the same idea. What you're doing is you're exposing them to the sort of representative design that they will face in the real life scenario, so they have a chance to tune to the perceptual variables which are important when you're driving the real track. And what we're doing is we're not only doing that chance to get representative practice, but we're also quantifying something which coaches really have to rely on video and sort of intelligent guesswork. It's the same as the concussion. You're giving them a quantitative representation of what their keepers are doing right or wrong.
How do you get that kind of first person perspective of the ball moving?
From a virtual reality perspective.
Yeah.
So we use a physics engine in it's a program called Unity 3D, and it's what we use to generate all our virtual reality content. And it has a built-in physics engine, so we can manipulate the physics of the ball whatever way you want. And for the coaches, it's just a nice little graphic user interface, and you just tick all these different parameters that you want on the ball, and then it'll be a representative based on the physics you've applied to that.
So it's not a video of the activity taking place.
No, the keeper is in the virtual reality behaving as they would in a real life game, and that's the difference, is it's representative.
Yeah. So they're immersed.
Yep. And the actions you perform in the virtual reality will be the same actions you will perform in real life. Wow. So it has that action fidelity, which we bang on about in virtual reality, is if you don't have, you can sacrifice visual fidelity, you can make things less graphically interesting or more graphically interesting, you can make it more narrative based, you can create a cool story around your virtual reality. But if you cannot behave in virtual reality like you would in real life, you don't have a virtual reality product.
Now that's really interesting. So in my mind, what I'm thinking then is that if I was to utilize this technology, which I'd be very excited to do, what I would be doing is I would be placing my goalkeepers in a real world scenario, and I would be exposing them to as many kind of deliveries as I could. I would then be giving them a period of time in the kind of virtual environment, and then I'd be bringing them back to the real world environment to see whether we see any improvement, not necessarily in performance. I mean, ideally you're hoping that, but in terms of their movement capabilities and and the way they're perceiving the ball movement. And I'm assuming that's the sort of thing that you'll be testing.
Transfer is key. Yeah. So that's something we're very keen on, but the reason we're confident about transfer is because the information is preserved. And this is something Andrew Wilson's doing a lot of research on, is that the way to ensure transfer is to ensure that the information they receive in the training task is the same that they would be doing in the actual real world task. And virtual reality is the perfect paradigm for that, because the visual information is preserved, because it's the same constraints you would face in real life.
Assuming that this is all about visual information, I mean, don't get me wrong, I think that is still pretty dominant here, but obviously the bit that you can't do is the kind of auditory array and the proprioceptive array that all play a role here. For example, surface is key, isn't it? Often, so you will often, you will be on a surface that affords only a certain amount of adhesion. So can you do that outside of the lab?
So the problem with the virtual reality is it's a light-based system. So what you would probably need to do is use it indoors, but you could probably put in synthetic turf to have that representative of proprioceptive representation. Yeah. But in terms of proprioception in general, one of the ways we've tried to ensure is we're trying to keep it as real life as possible is we have used sensor-based technology. So we give you a representation of your body in the virtual reality. So when the keepers first go in, they do this calibration process where they create a virtual avatar that maps on one-to-one with their actual bodily dimensions. So you have your real life body in the VR, which is really important for keepers because you need to know the relative length of your arm when you're making those diving saves.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the other thing I was going to say was, so I assume that this is essentially seen as an aid to training because, like you say, it gives you essentially repetition without repetition, whilst maintaining, the kind of the fidelity of the information sources. But going back to your point earlier about how hard it is, it's very hard to get the kind of accurate deliveries. However, you would have thought, though, wouldn't you, that coaches would be, given how a free kick is a really good opportunity to score, and also a very dangerous scenario for conceding, and how how one goal can often be so hard to score in football sometimes, that one goal is so important that set piece scenario you would think would be practiced with as much action fidelity as possible to not only make the deliverer of the free kick as effective as they can be, but the goalkeeper as effective as they can be at minimizing the possibilities of scoring happening there. And I mean, I know I get the point, right? Because I'm the same. It's hard. The players are like, I'm bored. I don't want to stand here pretending to be a wall or defending and these sorts of things. So, but at the very least, what you might do is, if you're in a professional context, you're going to bring your academy in, aren't you, to be defenders and to do, because you've got those players available who are prepared to do so because they obviously want to be they want to be helpful to the club. But even then, I just don't know of people doing it that way, or at least I'm probably massively who knows what goes on behind closed doors, but I'm not sure that the training of such an important set piece like that, or the practice in such an important set piece, which you would think you need to be doing in such a realistic way, is done that way. I think what generally happens for free kick training is everybody goes, and people who do free kicks stay behind with mannequins just trying to whip it in the top corner in a really kind of isolated way. Yep,
I agree. And it's something and it's not to say that these real life tasks aren't important, because they definitely are. And that's something we would always say with Incisive, is that the virtual reality doesn't replace real life training. It augments it.
Yes.
So this is an additional piece for your training, which will give you reliable free kicks under a variety of different constraints. And also it's a tool which allows you to, as a coach, to track and monitor your players' performance under these free kicks in a quantifiable way. But yes, I mean, representation is key and action fidelity is key, because it's like we were talking about earlier, when you're in the real life context, you have all this different stuff going around you that it's very easy to get drawn away into unreliable information sources. So to have keepers, when they're in that match context, say, yes, I have faced this type of free kick before, no problem, I picked up the perceptual variable I need to, and I can save the free kick, no problem. So that's where we really see the value in that technology. There's sort of three ways we see the value in that technology in general. First is profiling players, because suddenly you have a way to quantify how good your keeper is at picking up this perceptual information. The second is training, which we've talked about, and you're really getting more repetitions than you would before on a variety of different constraints. And then the third is rehabilitation, when you have players who are returning from injury, to get them back up to that match sharpness. And also the benefit of virtual reality is you can't get hurt. If you don't have the impact of the ball, you don't have to dive if you don't want to. You can control the free kicks, so they all fall in the range of just your arm span, so you never even have to dive if you don't want to. And you can build a VR so you can gradually get a return to play protocol in place for your players.
That's brilliant. I mean, I can see so many applications for this technology, because there are so many areas within sport that are really underdeveloped because of these environmental dynamics. So goalkeeping is definitely one, but like in cricket again, wicket keeping.
Yes.
I mean, wicket keepers just get very little opportunity to practice effectively. So for example, I grew up as a wicket keeper, and so batting normally happens in nets. So you can go in the nets, and I always wanted to work on standing up close to the ball to spinners, because it's a really quite specialised activity. But you need to do that with a batsman present, because obviously when a ball goes down the leg side of a batsman, that's a really difficult time for a keeper, because you're unsighted momentarily. So of course you're often predicting in that scenario, or you're predicting on a bounce profile. So first and foremost, you've got a problem there, because you're usually in a net environment which has a surface that is fairly even, and therefore lacks representativeness from a variable bounce perspective. But then you're in a net, so you're quite constrained. But also when batting players go into nets and they don't have any consequence for so firstly, they're batting on an even surface. It enables them to play different kinds of shots with more confidence than they can against an uneven one, with less movement. And then the second one is there's no consequence for them getting out, so they just play loads of shots. So you end up just standing behind the stumps, never really getting the ball.
Yes.
And so your training experience as a wicketkeeper is really quite minimal, unless you try and design something where the batsman's sort of deliberately letting the ball go, but then that has a degree of artificiality to it, albeit it's representative enough, but it doesn't happen very often, because you need somebody who's prepared enough to kind of deliberately miss through the gate, or allow the ball to go down the leg side and allow you to take the ball. So as a general rule, in a non-performance context, like a club environment, those who are wicket keepers end up just basically standing there with somebody whacking balls at them, just diving around and catching the ball. So they become exactly what you describe. I love that phrase. They become stimulus response creatures.
Yeah. So that it's exactly that, and it always comes back to this idea of action fidelity. In training, are your players behaving as they would in the real task environment? And if they aren't, what you're doing is you're starving them of practice that they need to really engage in the actual match. This happens a lot, bringing it back to sort of more theoretical principles. Every time you perform an action, as simple as it may be, sitting on a chair, ducking under a low-hanging branch, what we engage in is these different information gathering activities. We move our head, we walk around an object, and every time we do an action, we need that initial exploratory piece to really establish what the affordance is. And if you have a wicketkeeper and he's just sort of standing waiting for the ball, or he's waiting for the batsman to do this sort of artificial leave when he knows he could have hit it, you're starving him of those sort of information gathering activities he needs to do in the real life scenario. So this is why we're so passionate about virtual reality, is it gives you this control and it gives you an environment where people are behaving as they would in the real life context. It's funny, the research I was doing in virtual reality and cricket, you need to give them incentives to behave in that way. So when we initially built the cricket, we just said, okay, the goal is to score runs. And then suddenly the players were just swinging their bat as hard as they can at every single ball. And then you go, okay, we need to change the dynamics of this a bit. So we started introducing negative scoring, -5 if you got out. Yeah. And all these different activities, just to say, okay, what are the parameters we need to introduce to get them to behave as realistically as they can in the real life environment. And for things like clean sheet, where you've got a free kick and a wall, and you're getting them to actually coordinate their actions to intercept the ball, that's as realistic as it's going to get. They're not going to behave any differently in real life as they would in the VR.
Yeah. I mean, I became, by default, as a field hockey coach, I became a goalkeeper coach because I just recognized how important they are. If your goalkeeper has a really good day, or if your goalkeeper performs well, or even performs as expected, you have a far greater chance of being successful than if your goalkeeper performs below performance parameters, because one error can be pretty catastrophic.
Absolutely.
So, it's amazing to me how little emphasis is placed on those poor souls beyond literally acting as a human rebound board.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the last World Cup, 66% of the games were lost by one goal. And that's the difference between a keeper making a save and not. So that's such an incredibly important, and you're talking about wicket keepers in cricket. They are the most undervalued player in the team by far. If they have a bad day, you're conceding potentially 20 to 30 additional runs, which is the majority of games is the difference between winning and losing. And so you really, from both a player and a coach perspective, from a player, you want that practice which really gives you a chance to attune to those informational variables. And from a coach, you really need a method that tracks the player's progress in terms of how they're dealing with these different environmental tasks and individual constraints. And we think virtual reality is the way to do that, because you're giving you quantifiable measures and it's giving you quality of practice, which are the two pillars you really need.
And so as you guys sort of roll out this technology and it becomes utilized within more and more kind of performance contexts, and I imagine you might be getting some phone calls after this podcast, then what you've then got is an increased data set that you'll then be able to interpret, and then we'll be able to see some, I guess, combination of kind of lab and virtual and real data that then we can begin to start to interpret from an ecological perspective, and then will contribute to the skill acquisition research.
Exactly. And I think this is what we're most excited about. We're beginning to bridge the gap between researchers and coaches that exists. And, we as researchers, we sometimes get a bit carried away from the theoretical perspective, because a lot of the time, if you're a coach reading these papers, you say, well, that's all very fine and well, but what's the practical application? How can I take this information you've given me from this research into the real world? By using this cloud-based technology where you can track your players' performance, it gives coaches the chance to sort of behave almost as a researcher, because the back end of our our cloud technology does all the analysis for you. We've done the hard bit. We've done all these coordinates calculations, and then we just give you the end result. So we do different parameters like movement efficiency. Movement efficiency is, say the ball ends up to your right and you have one very direct route to the ball. It's how well did you stay on that route and how much did you deviate from that? So I'm not a coach, but I remember we've started to do this in the Northern Ireland Goalkeeping Academy. We've started to try this technology, and we got a player to face a variety of free kicks. And he did the session, and we sat down, and you can isolate what kicks you want to look at. So we saw that he had a real problem with curved free kicks that ended up in the top left-hand corner, which is fair enough. It's an incredibly difficult free kick to save. But suddenly we started to look at the metrics we had introduced, and we looked at initiation time, and we're like, okay, he doesn't change his initiation time at any point. And we looked at things like sort of erroneous movements. So did he start to go from left to right? It's like, no, he didn't really. And what we figured out was it was the movement speed that was the difference. So the player had sort of self-organized, and he figured out, I don't need to compensate on my hesitation. What I need to compensate on is my ability to get to the ball with speed. So suddenly there's from my perspective as not a coach, I saw a very clear reason as to why that player eventually self-organized in a way that he was able to figure out how to save the ball. So it's just bridging that gap that we have between application and theory.
And that, I assume, has significant potential applications for practice design.
Absolutely, because you have entire control over how you want to set up the design. So you can what you would do is you would tailor that to the individual. You would say, maybe the way I would probably do it is I would have them face a huge variety of kicks. From those huge variety of kicks, you isolate what their weaker areas are, and then you would design a representative design task with the variety of different constraints, so they can find the optimal, or sort of the optimal solution for their own action capabilities, in a way for them to effectively save the ball. And suddenly, the role of the coach, and it comes back to what, ecological dynamics is all about. We're going back to the coach as more of an architect and less of as an instructor. Suddenly the coach has a direct access to ability to manipulate what he wants in the environment for that keeper to find his optimal strategy. Absolutely.
And then, so you'll be able, potentially, in some contexts, I'm trying to think what those contexts would be, but you'll be able to almost tweak in the lab, so to speak, various parameters within the practice form, and find almost like an optimal practice form that then could be then potentially replicated in the real world.
Exactly. Yeah. That's where we see the value of profiling. Is you're figuring out what your players' weaknesses and strengths are, and then you can go, as you say, address them in the real world. This is the power of virtual reality as an augmentative tool. It's not suddenly you don't have to practice in the real world anymore. Instead, what it's doing is it's helping you as a coach identify, these are the things we need to work on. These are the constraints you're struggling with, and suddenly, your role as a coach becomes a lot more straightforward, in that you don't have to rely on your ability as a skilled perceiver. As a coach, you have to watch the player, figure out what he's doing, make these very educated guesses. Suddenly the data's in front of you. You know what you have to do. The route to practice is very clear.
Fascinating stuff, I have to say. I mean, it's an area, I think, where, obviously, I think, as we know that, kind of coaching is a little bit beset with tradition, and certainly, my experiences certainly so far have been that there are quite a number of individuals who want to be really quite critical of some of the ideas and concepts within the kind of ecological approach and the ecological dynamics. And one of the criticisms often leveled is, the kind of the lack of empirical research. Now, I think it's only a matter of time, isn't it, before for example, your technology is very much filling that gap. I also think what's really interesting is that, many of the criticisms are coming from people who are, I guess, espousing a, kind of traditional approaches as being, the tried and tested is good. It's always been good. It's always worked. If it's not broke, don't fix it type approach. But in many ways, the innovation in coaching is coming from researchers who are, kind of looking to test, I suppose, hypotheses around, kind of ecological approaches and their, the effectiveness of them. So, I don't see the same level of innovation happening, and maybe this is just my bias because I don't read it, but I don't see the same level of innovation certainly in the kind of sporting physical activity domain coming from people essentially looking to say, well, this form of repetitive practice done in isolated ways provides this level of performance outcome. I just don't see that kind of research being done at the moment, but I could be wrong. I mean, tell me if I am wrong.
Well, I mean, in terms of technology, I mean, there's plenty of technology that's been inspired by the information processing approach, this idea of improving your players' declarative knowledge, their ability to multitask, all these ideas, and they're very, pressing a button on a screen when you see a certain stimulus. And
Yes.
Also, we talked about earlier, the sort of point light displays where as soon as you see a green light, you have to hit it as fast as you can.
Yeah.
They do exist, but sometimes I fear they go too far down the route of practical application and a bit too far away from theoretical underpinnings. So, ecological dynamics gets a lot of criticism, largely because it's hard to do. What you're asking of the coach is very difficult, because it comes back to the problem of, well, it'd be great if we could allow the keeper to self-organize in relation to these informational variables you're getting from a spinning ball. But how do I get practice design in such a way that the keeper can get enough repetition to get to that? And then suddenly when somebody comes in and says, well, here's an iPad, tap on the screen when you see this, suddenly that's a lot more, that's a lot more desirable because it's easier to do. But I think from an ecological dynamics point of view, I think the theoretical underpinning is very, very strong. And because of that, the conclusions we draw from the technology are can be very applicable to the real life situation, which is exactly what you want from your technology. I mean, a lot of these improvements you see when you use these sort of iPad technologies, a lot of it's just incidental. I mean, they may so happen to have a good game after they've practiced with that technology. It's not clear that the transfer is there.
There's just not this level of thought given to it. I mean,
yes.
Even from the perspective of even the question of transfer, it's kind of almost like that doesn't matter. The idea is that no one is ever looking, and whenever you do, you pose that question, and you. In fact, I was doing a bit of work the other day with a couple of coaches, volunteer coaches at my local club, just sort of helping them out with a bit of observation. And one of the questions I posed was, you did a practice task that was kind of like, an isolated practice form that was very much, done in a very kind of slow and static, even walking pace way. We then went into a game, which was like a 9v9 game with an awful lot of chaos going on. Did you see the actions that you worked on in your practice task happen in the game?
Yep.
And they all went, not really. But it was almost like that was not a question that is usually considered.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's taken as read. We've done this. We're going to do a game. We'll kind of sort of let it go from there.
Yes, yeah. But I think as well, you need to consider the origins of the founders of the technology. So a lot of these technological advances based on the information processing perspective, a lot of them aren't from a research background. So I think that's one of the reasons we are very excited about starting up a company, is that we have 20 years of research experience behind our backs, and because of Cathy, in that we can say, we have studied these principles. We understand what it takes to get action fidelity. We understand what you need for transfer. We understand what you need to self-organize. And then suddenly we are just building technology around how we achieve that. So the technology is built on the principles rather than building the technology and then hoping the principles just sort of work themselves out and once you sell the technology to the teams.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. I do think with many of these, like for example, light reaction arrays or whatever they are, they are designed because somebody thinks, oh, that would be an interesting idea.
Yeah.
And then they almost kind of retrofit the research to prove the case. But the research is nearly always that somebody gets better at the practice task, not that they get better in the performance domain.
Yes, and you see it a lot with these sort of white papers that these companies push out, is that they will do their own studies done by their own employees, and they're saying all these amazing things about how much improvement their technology goes, and it's exactly as you say, the improvement is in purely within the realms of the technology, and none of it is actually, oh, did you measure this when they were out in the real game? Well, no. Well, it's okay. Well, then what's the point of the technology? They said the same about these brain training games back when they were popular, in the early 2000s, is that they didn't improve general cognitive ability. They just improved your ability to play well in that game. So it's the same principle. So once you have a researcher or you have a company that puts the theory first, suddenly you can be a lot more confident in, okay, these guys really put the effort in understanding what the technology is doing. And then, we would never put clean sheet out unless we were sure it worked. In other words, unless it would align with our principles.
And I assume also you're very much going out there saying, this is an experimental technology. We are constantly going to be refining and improving the product based on what we find from our field-based testing or field-based application.
Yeah, it's data-driven. So when we get all of the data we get is available to the coaches, but also it goes into our cloud, and we can sort of see from that data, okay, there's, this technology can be refined in such a way as we can really start to target what are the key parameters that is involved in skill acquisition and goalkeeping. These are the things that matter, and these are the things we need to target. And then it's just a case of sending out a patch or an update to the technology. The guys already have it, the coaches have it, and then you're just saying, okay, the data is saying this is what we need to do to get the maximize the training your goalkeepers are getting in that virtual reality technology.
And I imagine obviously there's a lot of grassroots kind of community-based coaches who listen to this podcast, and a number of them are probably thinking, well, this is all well and good because this is just for the pros and they'll be using this technology. And usually that's probably true because they're the ones with the money who are, well, firstly, they've got the reason to invest because the return on investment could be great for them, and they're looking for any performance edge that they can find. Get that. And so if any of those community coaches who may have switched off like an hour ago or whatever, they're going to miss out. They're going to miss out now, because the best thing about this technology is, okay, at the moment, because of the nature of probably the way your computing power that you need, et cetera, this needs to be done in some kind of environment. But before very long, I'm assuming you'll be able to put this technology into a handheld device which can be used anywhere and really quite cost effectively.
It's something we're very, very passionate about, is getting this out to grassroots, and it is a matter of figuring out a way to reduce the costs in a way that's manageable at grassroots level. I think where we really see an application for that is the similar when we were talking about concussion on the on-pitch thing, is these portable computerless virtual reality headsets, because suddenly all you have to do then is buy the headset and everything else is done for you. I mean, at the minute, what we have for Clean Sheet is we have different levels of access. So we have, a Clean Sheet, say bronze, which has so many features that you can access, and it's at the cheapest range, and that would be more for your grassroots level. And then we have silver and gold, and your gold is more your Premier League side. It's something we really are passionate about, because, as you say, the applications for this at grassroots level are huge in terms of developing your kids and to be the next Petr Cech or whatever else.
Well, I mean, fascinating area, to be honest. We've not centered in on kind of coaching technology a great deal on the podcast. Probably been a bit remiss in that respect. And I think your research is fascinating. It's definitely something I'm really interested to kind of continue to look at. I've got a few ideas I'm going to share with you when we've stopped recording, because I think there's a lot of domains for this.
Yeah.
So listen, like I said, people are probably going to want to get in touch, because I'm sure you're going to have no end of willing volunteers wanting to, in inverted commas, beta test the idea. But obviously they're not going to do that. They'll. I mean, anyway, you can obviously speak to them. But anyway, if anybody wants to get in touch, how do they do that?
Yes. So if you are interested in our work in Incisive, what I would recommend for you to do is go to our website. So that is incisive.tech. It's INCISIV, and what you can do there is it will give you a link to contact us, and then you can go directly to Cathy, and you can discuss how you would want to work with the technology and with Clean Sheet. terms of me, you can find me on Twitter. My handle is, what is my handle? It is James Stafford 94. You can get me on there. And also Incisive has its own Twitter handle as well. It's Incisive Sport. So any of those are a great way to reach out to us if you want to find out more. And if you have any specific questions for me, reach out to me on Twitter. I'm more happy to talk you through anything else. And if there's anything else in relation to my research or anything you're interested in talking about, fire away. More than happy to have that discussion.
Brilliant stuff. James, listen, I really appreciate you coming on the show. It's been a really fascinating conversation, and all the best with both the research and also the applied work and actually the business with Incisive. I think it's going to be a really exciting time to see the information that you get back from that.
Thank you so much, Stuart. It was a pleasure talking to you. I love the podcast.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.